Well, hi, everyone. I hope you're happy to be here for our final session of COVID-19 Colorado and Beyond. The webinar has been sponsored by the University of Colorado, Denver's Colorado College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and its continuing and professional education and interdisciplinary studies programs. By now, you know that I am Marjorie Levine Clark. I'm a professor of history and associate dean for diversity outreach and initiatives in the college, and I have been moderating the series. If you have a question during the lecture, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will take all questions at the end of the presentation. Information about student credit and continuing education units can be found on our continuing and professional education website. And Kristen Salisbury gave me some reminders for you that the enrollment form to receive academic credit is due by 5 p.m. tomorrow. And for students, all essays must be uploaded to Canvas by August 11th, okay? And the registration form to sign up for continuing education units is August 10th. The deadline is August 10th. And all these form links will be listed on the program webpage later today. Got that? So students interested in credit, as you know by now, have to write a one-page paper for every lecture. And the prompt for today's lecture is, how should we balance personal preferences and community responsibilities when it comes to infectious disease response? What do we gain and what do we lose by doing it the way that you suggest? I'll give that again. How should we balance personal preferences and community responsibilities when it comes to infectious disease response? What do we gain and what do we lose by doing it the way that you suggest? This prompt will also be posted on the course website along with all the other questions. The lectures are also being recorded and will be up on the website and the CLAS YouTube page. So one final time, I have to thank all these people who made this webinar series happen. First, Dean Pam Jansma and Assistant Dean Joanne Porter of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for supporting this program and making credit available to many of our students at no cost. Our outstanding faculty who volunteered their time for this series. Mike Effler and Noah Dodero from the Office of Information Technology, Sheena Bull, Amy Arnold, and the Office of Digital Education, Interim Associate Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs, Joanne Brennan, the University Registrar, Carrie John and her team, Associate Bursar Eric Gray, and then from our college, Tracy Combe, Director of Marketing and Communication, Laurel Dodds, Director of Continuing and Professional Education, Course Curriculum Coordinator, Mary Lovett, and finally, Kristen Salisbury, the Program Manager for Continuing and Professional Education, who has just been great to work with on this series and really helped put this event together. I'm going to take a sip of water. Our lecturer today is Jennifer Reich, Professor of Sociology and Director of the University Honors and Leadership Program. Professor Reich received her PhD in sociology from the University of California, Davis. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, Fixing Families, Parents, Power, and the Child Welfare System, and more recently, Calling the Shots, Why Parents Reject Vaccines. She'll be talking a little bit about that today. Her current research projects focus on healthcare decision-making and patients' experience with medical systems. Welcome, Professor Reich.
Thanks for having me. Everything look good on your end? Good. So I'll start by saying that I'm honored to be the last speaker, and that also means that I have some, I'm following behind greatness throughout this series. And so I'm in some ways lucky because many of the people who spoke before me brought up a lot of the terms that I would hope we could talk about. So some of this might feel a little bit like review in certain places. And in others, I'm hoping to bring together some new threads and thinking that maybe taking everything we've learned this summer, we can find some paths forward. So I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about me. As Marjorie mentioned, I'm a professor of sociology, and I'm sorry, I have to make sure my slides are working. There we go. And I've spent about more than a decade thinking and listening to why parents refuse some or all vaccines for their children and how they come to make that decision. And so I've listened to scientists, to parents, to pediatricians, to naturopaths and chiropractors, to attorneys, to researchers and vaccine inventors and people in government tell me why they think we are so far apart in our thinking about vaccine and the places that's taken me in my travels. I'm not going to talk a lot about this research, but I'm happy to point you to other things where I do if you're interested, but I'm going to draw on some of what I've learned. So my goal today is really to think about the politics of vaccination in general, and then identify some of the ways this is arising with COVID and the ways it's about to, I think, move forward in dramatic ways as we move towards having a COVID vaccine. Now, I'll just admit up front that I'm going to refer to it as a COVID vaccine, despite the fact that that's incorrect, but saying a vaccine against the SARS-CoV-2 virus seems a little cumbersome. So for shorthand, I'll call it the COVID vaccine, but you'll know that that's an imperfect terminology. The thing about infectious disease is at its core, we're forced to engage in a different kind of discussion about personal freedom and community responsibility than we are with almost any other kind of health decision. And that's for one very simple reason. It's because diseases are contagious. And so no matter what our personal choices are, our personal decisions and their outcomes never remain entirely with us because of the contagious nature of viruses. And so when we think about vaccines, we're thinking about this very juncture about how we're going to balance these and move them forward. So I'm going to start actually upstream, just talking a little bit about the assumptions that get built into vaccines.
Professor Wright?
Yeah.
Just, I didn't know if you had your slides up because we're not seeing them.
Oh, that's so sad because they're really cute. Let me just make sure I can make them work. Thanks for letting me know. I guess it's not a Zoom meeting if there's not some kind of technological snafu. All right, so let's try this one more time. All right,
good.
Look better now?
Yep, thank you.
Sure. All right, so we talked about this. We talked about the places my book has taken me. We've talked about the way we're going to balance personal freedoms and community responsibility today. And I'm going to borrow from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and some of their models, and we're going to talk about two hypothetical children named Chip and Dale. And so in their example of how vaccines work best, does this look like a slideshow to you, Marjorie?
You need to go to your present, yeah.
Oh, good. Let's see. There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, that looks much better. Okay, so we take two hypothetical children, Chip and Dale. And Chip plays with a child in his class who it turns out has measles. 10 days later, Chip develops a high fever, a running nose, pink eye, and a rash. And the rash consists of red bumps that start on his face and work their way down to the rest of his body. After 2 more days, Chip starts to have trouble breathing, and his breathing is short and rapid. Chip's mother takes him to the doctor where he gets an x-ray of his chest, and the x-ray shows that he has pneumonia, which is a common side effect of measles infection. Chip is admitted to the hospital where he stays for 5 days and finally recovers. After having fought off a measles infection, Chip will never get measles again, or said another way, Chip is now immune to the measles virus. He's immune because his body, the cells in his body made antibodies to this virus, and he has these memory B cells that develop during infection that should stay with him for the rest of his life. Now, we could take another child named Dale, who also played with the child who has measles. But Dale never develops the symptoms of measles. He doesn't get the rash, he doesn't get pneumonia, he doesn't get a fever. But he was also infected with the same virus. And without those symptoms, he too will develop memory B cells. He too will become immune, and he is what we call an asymptomatic infected carrier. So he's capable of infecting other people, but might not even know he's sick. Now, we can agree that Chip paid a much higher price for his immunity than did Dale, and they both are going to come out with immunity to measles. And it's worth noting that before a measles vaccine was licensed in 1963, measles would infect about 4 million children every year. It would kill about 3,000 children. And globally, measles accounts for about 10% of all deaths of children every year. So measles remains a significant health issue. Now, both children are immune, both presented risk to others in the community. They pay different amounts of price based on their experience of that infection. But vaccines aim to intervene by providing the same kind of immunity without those same kinds of risks to the individual or to the community. They do it by using a weak or killed virus or bacteria, and which allows the immune system to recognize it and build that same kind of memory B immune cells, but without the ability to make you sick. So to put it in context, if a normal virus can reproduce thousands of times, a weakened live virus in a vaccine can reproduce fewer than 20 times, which usually can't make you sick. And in the case of an inactivated or killed virus or bacteria, it can't reproduce at all. And as we're going to see with the COVID vaccine, some of the proposals use no actual virus in them, but instead use synthesized RNA and DNA instead. So when we think about these different kinds of infection patterns, we have to think about then what level of the community would have to be vaccinated for a vaccine to help us stave off infection. And so what we can see is that when we talk about the herd immunity level, and I believe Dr. Samet and Adams addressed some of this in their talks as well, different diseases have a different level of contagion. So with something like measles, which we just talked about, measles is airborne, as is COVID, but measles is a very, very infectious disease. And we would expect that one infected person can infect as many as 12 to 18 other people. So each individual case exponentially affects others. And that we know that other diseases that are a little bit harder to transmit will have a lower number, a lower R0 factor, or a different level of infectiousness. And what that means then is when we think about what percentage of the community needs to be vaccinated for us to basically starve the virus of hosts that are not immune, that threshold level is going to look really different. And this is what we know of existing vaccine preventable diseases. And so you'll see with something like measles, we need a higher percentage of the population to be immunized than we do with some other harder to transmit viruses. And there are robust arguments happening right now about what level of herd immunity we're going to need when it comes to something like this coronavirus, with dramatically wide range of possible threshold levels. And that's still being sorted out because we're less sure about the R0 factor. So when we think about how herd immunity works, just to kind of break it down, what we see with herd immunity is that a vaccinated child more or less creates a firewall between somebody who's infected and someone who's unvaccinated. So if child A is infected with a vaccine preventable disease and child C is unvaccinated, then that middle vaccinated child B is going to prevent or protect child C from infection. And what we officials often refer to as the free rider phenomenon is that child C can get away with being unvaccinated so long as there's a whole bunch of vaccinated children Bs providing that protection for them. When we look at this at a population level, what we see then is that if we picture that all of the red-coded people are infected with a virus and all the all the blue people are unimmunized, then when we have a critical mass of those green people in between, you can see that it makes it hard for those red infected people to infect those unvaccinated people. And this is the way we create herd immunity. And we talk about it in this way because it's impossible to ever successfully immunize 100% of a population for a variety of reasons. We know that some people cannot be safely vaccinated because of underlying health conditions. We know that some people who become immune compromised lose their cellular memory to vaccines. And so vaccines don't really work for them. A small number of people will just not develop immunity even when vaccinated. And some people are too young or too old to be vaccinated. So we know that there's a critical mass of people who cannot be vaccinated, but that if we can hit that large number in the community with herd immunity, we can actually protect them. So I'm going to stop for a second about the sort of public health thing that I think this should sound familiar and instead jump to some of the history of vaccines. because the history, it turns out, is informative for us thinking about where we are and where we're going. So most histories of vaccine policies start with Edward Jenner, a famous he was a British doctor, and he made this famous observation in 1796 that milkmaids did not catch smallpox because they were frequently exposed to cowpox, a virus that was related to smallpox but couldn't actually infect humans. And he realized that they were getting some kind of immunity through their exposure to cowpox while they were milking cows. And so he developed a technique of variolation where he took matter from cowpox, scabs and pustules and pus from cowpox, and he inserted it in the skin of healthy people as a way of trying to protect them from smallpox infection. And in fact, the word vaccination comes from the Latin root vacca, which originates with cows. So to say a few words about smallpox. Smallpox has been one of history's most feared and dreaded diseases. Smallpox has gruesome symptoms. It has high fatality and it spreads very quickly. As one historian noted, its symptoms begin with chills, aches, fever, and then progressed ominously to nausea, vomiting, and difficulty breathing. About a week after infection, bright red pustules developed on the victim's face, hands, and then spread over their entire body. Eventually, the pustules dried and itched intensely, scabbed over, and fell off. About 1 in 4 victims died. Those who survived were usually scarred for life and often blinded. Children, who were generally more vulnerable to infection, died from the condition more often than did adults, but it struck young and old alike, and without regard to social class. So a lot of our very early arguments about vaccines originate with our very first vaccine against smallpox. And what we saw is that despite this being seen as an important innovation, it was also seen with significant distrust. And this is a really famous cartoon in which you can see that the people who are being variolated are sprouting animal parts and cow limbs and tails and things from that kind of cow infection. And it's also worth noting that at the time, there were no hypodermic needles, there were no antiseptics. And so the process itself of variolation carried with it some risk, as people might have used a sharp object to create an incision. It would have ground non-sterile genetic material into that wound, and it carried some risk of infection in a time before antibiotics. So it was not an entirely neutral intervention, but because smallpox was so feared, it was still considered incredibly useful. We saw early efforts to convince people that smallpox were important, and this is around a turn of the century public health campaign material. But we also saw laws to require vaccination. And the first of these was passed in Massachusetts in 1809, which was the first mandate to require vaccination. Now, at the time, the federal government had a very minor role in almost everything, and states were required for almost everything. It was one of the most notable active involvements of the federal government, because in 1813, the US Congress passed an act to encourage vaccination, which among other provisions appointed an agent to give out certified vaccine material to anyone who requested it and required the Postal Service to ship it for free. The act was repealed 9 years later, however, because there was an incident in which smallpox material rather than cowpox material was distributed, resulting in several deaths. Now, securing the vaccination of all citizens was recognized as a public duty, which is how the government stepped forward. But it also became a subject of debate as local governments tried to enact requirements. And one such example was in 1820, when the residents of North Hero, Vermont, voted to institute a tax to pay for vaccination against smallpox in their area. Now, Dan Hazen was present at the town meeting when this was discussed and where the tax was approved, but he did not vote for it and he refused to pay it. In response, the town's constable seized his cow and sold it to raise the money for the required payment. Hazen sued, and about 10 years later, the US Supreme Court said that in fact, that seizure and sale was reasonable. Now, this question of whether or not you can require vaccination, not just payment for it, but require vaccination itself, came up pretty readily. And part of it is that it emerged from a pretty powerful anti-vaccine movement of the time period. In the second half of the 19th century, anti-vaccination organizations formed throughout the US, but mostly in the Northeast. And these groups distributed pamphlets they lobbied legislatures, and they aimed to repeal any law that for required vaccination. They also filed lawsuits, and they sought to actively discourage vaccination amongst those who would freely choose it. And their rhetoric rested on two claims that are going to sound familiar as we move forward in time. One is that vaccination was a dangerous and unnecessary procedure. And two, that to compel it through law was a violation of the country's foundational belief in individual liberty. Now, at the same time period that these claims were emerging, it's worth noting that we also saw the movement towards mandatory school attendance laws, mandatory education, other kinds of public health interventions, and those two were criticized as undermining parental authority. And these are not separate instances, because the reason vaccines became required in large part was because of mandatory school requirements, and the idea that if you were going to require kids to be in a school building together, then you want to make sure that they could be safe. It's also worth noting that because variolation had been relatively successful, smallpox began disappearing in this time period. And many people who had never experienced an epidemic firsthand started to believe that vaccination was unnecessary and became sympathetic to these claims. So in 1905, the US Supreme Court heard a challenge known as Jacobson versus Massachusetts. And the argument was that Jacobson did not wish to vaccinate his child or himself against smallpox, even though it was required. And he presented a long list of religious and personal beliefs against it. And in a 7-2 ruling, the US Supreme Court declared that compulsory vaccination was a legitimate exercise of the state government's police powers. That was the term they used, police powers, to guard the health, welfare, and safety and morals of its citizens. And in doing so, they identified both scientific consensus that the relationship between vaccination and prevention of disease was legitimate. And then they said that if duly elected legislatures had determined that smallpox was a threat and that vaccination was an effective way to prevent it, then laws requiring all citizens to comply were not unreasonable. And they said society based on the rule that each one is a law unto itself would soon be confronted with disorder and anarchy. So vaccines became seen as a commodity, but also as a resource governments could use to encourage public health and to support communities, even if individuals were not interested. Now, in the subsequent decades, we see a rising support for science and medicine and trust in the miracle that is medical research. And one way this came through was in the invention of penicillin, which was a game changer for thinking about infectious disease, and did a great deal, particularly around World War II, to renew trust and faith in the importance of the scientific method and scientific process. What we also saw, though, in the 1950s was the advent of the polio vaccine. Now, polio was a devastating disease that could cause paralysis and death. And what's little known is that not everybody who became infected became paralyzed or died. In fact, there weren't that many as a percentage of total infected, but the disease was highly contagious and a huge number were infected every year. So as an example, in 1952, which was an epidemic year, 58,000 people got polio and 3,000 died. Now, not unlike COVID, it was spread easily, and it was hard to predict who would be the person who became paralyzed or who died, and who would have a much more mild case. And there was no correlates to class, to nutrition, to neighborhood. People were equally affected. So the disease was subjected to a huge amount of fear, and it was mostly a summer disease, and it mostly struck in the warm summer months. And so what you hear from people who lived through this era is that there was campaigns for social distancing, swimming pools were frequently drained, movie theaters were closed all summer because of the risk of infection. And in people I've talked to who lived through this generation, they frequently talk about their mothers closing all the windows on hot summer days without air conditioning to try to keep the virus outside their home. So the search for a polio vaccine was significant, and it was funded by what became the March of Dimes, through small donations, literally dimes, that were at movie theaters and stores where people could drop dimes to support the national search for a polio vaccine. And the vaccine that proved successful was an inactivated polio vaccine put forward by Jonas Salk and his research team. And Jonas Salk at the time, I think, was 35 years old, and reaped a great deal of credit for the importance of this, ranging from a postage stamp to things called sock hops to celebrate his achievement. Now, When asked about how this moved forward, I guess there's an upstream, in order to test the vaccine, they partnered with local schools, and thousands of school children were lined up and immunized. And half of them received the vaccine and half received a placebo. And then they watched to see who became sick to decide that the vaccine was successful. And research of this time shows that more people knew about the field trials for this vaccine than knew who was, I think, the Vice President of the United States. This was ubiquitous, and people felt ownership of this because they had funded it, they had supported it. Celebrities were out in front of this disease, and they had a president who had been stricken with polio. So people felt invested in this solution. And lining up school children for an untested vaccine in a way that I think today would be very hard to imagine, this was part of public ownership. When Jonas Salk was asked about patenting the vaccine, he answered, "There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" and insisted the vaccine belongs to the people. Now, the result of all of this was that demand for the vaccine was overwhelming and instantaneous, even without a requirement. People wanted this vaccine. And the largest question to policy then became who should get it first. There was confusion and there was no national leadership or organizations to decide. Should it go for people who could pay for it? Should it go for people who were the most vulnerable? How do we decide? And it was clear that pharmaceutical companies, even though there were several participating at the time, I think 30 were licensed to produce it, they could not produce enough in time for the coming summer months. So nationally, the federal government prioritized children ages 5 to 9, who appeared to be the largest risk age group, followed by children 1 to 5. And they prioritized the southern region of the country, which was more likely to have warmer temperatures, and made that the first priority for distribution. But it became more complicated. Pediatricians argued that their patients who could pay for it deserved it, while other people pointed out that low-income children had lower access to the vaccine, but would continue to present a risk to others if unimmunized, and therefore just giving it to those who could pay was not going to solve the problem of contagion. Public trust remained high in the vaccine, even as there was a year of a vaccine that was manufactured badly that harmed people, which was a blip in terms of public trust. And with that public trust, we saw the advent of additional vaccines, including that against measles in 1963, mumps in 1967, and rubella in 1969. Now, after these new vaccines were licensed through the 1960s, I'll just say, like, as examples of the popularity you have with the polio, Elvis promoting it, someone in an iron lung learning that the vaccine, and then also Dr. Salk testing it on his own child as a show of confidence. But when we get to the 1960s, what you see is that as these new vaccines became licensed, it became really clear from polio and forward that high-income children had better access to vaccines than did low-income children. And as he launched the Great Society to deal with poverty across the country, he fought for a vaccine program where the federal government would create new funds to fund vaccines and distribute them, and also would incentivize states to create requirements for vaccines as a way of increasing social justice. So by requiring the vaccines, federal funds became available. And by requiring the vaccines, you increased uptake in those states, which prevented illnesses in children, was the logic. And so as an example, at the time, LBJ started advocating for state laws to require vaccination for school attendance. You can see that in 1965, roughly 25 states had such laws. And by, let's see, from 1968 to 1974, that number grew from 25 to 40. And then states without laws finally joined in with, and by 1981, Idaho, Iowa, and Wyoming became the last states to enact laws, making all 50 states able to, or requiring vaccines for school attendance. And it's worth noting that Christian Scientists lobbied against this, and were successfully able in 48 of those 50 states to write into state laws that there could be an exemption for religious belief. And those two states that refused were West Virginia and Mississippi. And since then, what we've learned in the last several years is we now have 5 states that do not allow exemptions for religious objections or personal or philosophical beliefs. And so here's a quick map of the states. The lightest color states are the ones that do not allow any exemptions for any reason other than medical. And Other states have a religious exemption or a religious and a philosophical or personal belief exemption. And you'll notice Colorado has all three kinds of exemptions in our state and remains one of the states that is the easiest to opt out of vaccine requirements. So in thinking about, vaccines as compulsion and also the view of both trust and questions about access and how this ties into community goals and personal preferences, we saw that uses of vaccines went up as laws became required. And through the 1970s, this looked really promising until there became a tension in the early 1980s that the whole cell pertussis vaccine, so a vaccine against whooping cough that's no longer used, that used a whole cell attenuated but live virus, seemed to cause a high level of side effects, including seizures, brain damage, and occasionally death. And the rates are estimated to be about 1 in 1 million. And what happened was that in 1982, a documentary aired on NBC called Vaccine Roulette. And it was the first time there was public coverage that vaccines could be dangerous and that vaccines could cause harm. Parents of children believed that they were harmed, saw the show, and contacted the studio. And that NBC affiliate studio put parents in touch with each other, who began meeting in living rooms in Washington, D.C. And over time, they formed a group they called Dissatisfied Parents Together, or DPT, after the diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus vaccine that they were concerned about. And over time, that organization evolved to become the National Vaccine Information Center, which today is the largest American organization that opposes vaccine mandates. And in the bottom of this picture is Barbara Loe Fisher and her children, who her oldest, she says, was vaccine injured from the DPT vaccine, which motivated her. This story and listening to the narratives of families was compelling, and it did a great deal to raise suspicions about the safety of vaccines. At the same time, families began suing vaccine manufacturers, and vaccine manufacturers decided that the profits did not outweigh the risks and decided they would no longer manufacture vaccines. And so the result was that in 1986, Congress created a law that shielded vaccine manufacturers from liability by creating a claims court where claims of vaccine injury would be handled administratively by a tax paid on every vaccine instead of by manufacturers. So as we move forward in time, that brings us, I think, more or less to where we are now. So not unlike the fear Americans saw in the past, whether it was smallpox or polio or other infectious disease, we are all living in fear of infection. And infections that we estimate are invisible, that some of us are more fearful than others, and that we can never predict if we're going to be someone who becomes infected and is asymptomatic or has a mild case or is significantly infected. We can look at the categories that have been well described in public health and see that certain age groups are at greater risk, and that there appears at the younger ages to be differences by race and ethnicity in terms of who gets the sickest or who dies. And these are crude death rates per 100,000. And you can see them by age and by race and ethnicity. And so we can see that there are patterns within these data, but none of those patterns predict our own experience. They tell us the likelihood, but it doesn't predict what's going to happen with us in particular. We can see this most recently by the statements of Eduardo Rodriguez, who took a break from the Red Sox based on his experience of serious symptoms, including heart and lung damage that resulted from his infection. And he stated last week that the coronavirus left him feeling, quote, 100 years old. He says it took him about 10 days before he was able to even do light throwing. He said, "I've never been that sick in my life, and I don't want to get that sick again," and stepped away from Major League Baseball. And we can't predict who's going to be significantly infected. And we see stories that a married older couple, the wife is asymptomatic, the husband ends up in the ICU, and it's very challenging to explain or predict how that's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And that adds to our sense of fear and the lack of clarity in how we're going to move forward. And so the promise all along has been that we are going to get a vaccine, and that in the same way vaccines saved us from all these other infectious diseases over time, we imagine a magic bullet, right? We imagine that a COVID vaccine will arrive and we will all be able to return to movie theaters and concerts and sporting events and university classrooms all together, and that we will somehow be freed of this as soon as a vaccine comes to license. Now, this is an old story. We've seen this story before. And much like the story, we're going to also see that there's similar kinds of questions that we should ask about how this is going to play out within the systems we have, within our sense of trust and our own perceptions of our lives. Now, it's worth saying that there are currently about 165 vaccines in development around the world. And if you're interested, I put at the bottom, the New York Times has a vaccine tracker, and you can look at the stages of every vaccine and where it is in development and what the licensing looks like, and they update it daily. It's worth noting that prior to COVID, the fastest vaccine to be invented from identifying the virus through licensing was the mumps vaccine in 1967, which took about 4 years. And so the goal here then is for a virus we didn't even know about before January, and in the US, probably March, we are aiming to go from viral identification to rollout in less than a year, which is unprecedented. So let's talk about what has to happen to make that work. So this is what usually happens with vaccines. We have preclinical testings. Scientists give the vaccine to animals, usually mice or monkeys, to see if it produces an immune response. And then they look at indications of safety. Did the animals die? Did they become very sick? And scientists recommend that the best preclinical data come from more than one animal model, and that you might see different kinds of responses in different kinds of animal models. If all looks well, scientists can go on to what we call a phase 1 safety trial. And in this, a small number of people are given a proposed vaccine to test its safety, and they're often given it at different dosages to see at what point they develop some kind of immune response and at what point they get very, very sick, and to identify what would be the appropriate dosage for this. If phase 1 safety trials look promising and go well, and it's worth noting that more than half of products that enter the FDA approval process never make it to market, then it's, at any of these phases, any vaccine can fail. But if that looks promising, we go on to phase 2, which is gives us a little bit more room to understand what's happening. So there might now be several hundred vaccines in the COVID vaccine trials, and I drew mostly on Moderna data because they seem in the US to be the furthest along. They enrolled 300 younger adults and 300 older adults in phase 2. So scientists give the vaccine to about 100 people or hundreds of people to see if it acts differently in them than it did in the dozens of people they did in phase 1. And they're still looking for a safety profile, and they're also looking to see if there's evidence of an immune system response. So does it look like immune cells are starting to show up within the body in response to the vaccine? And what scientists have mostly learned from phase 2 is that it's going to take 2 vaccines 29 days apart to generate an immune response. That there was, I think, there were side effects in almost all participants, but most of them were pretty mild, like swelling at the injection site, and that a small number of participants, I think 21%, had very high fevers within days of getting the vaccine that went away. And so that takes us to phase 2. If phase 2 goes well, then researchers get to move on to phase 3. And with phase 3, this is an efficacy trial. So it's not enough to say a vaccine is safe and that it generates an immune response if we don't know that that immune response is going to prevent infection. And so what scientists have to show in phase 3 is that the vaccine prevents illness or it lowers the severity of illness. And so thousands of people will be enrolled in this trial. Half of them will get the vaccine and half will get a placebo. And then they'll be compared over time to see who becomes infected and who doesn't. And what the FDA has signaled in a memo is that they expect 50% efficacy. So that means that amongst the people who get the vaccine, they have to be half as likely to become infected or hospitalized or seriously ill. So it doesn't have to prevent 100% of infections, it has to prevent about 50. And so one way to think about this is we expect the measles vaccine to prevent 98% of infections, but the flu vaccine tends to be somewhere between 40 and 60%. And what we know from the flu vaccine is that people who can still become infected with the flu, but they're not going to get seriously ill and they're not going to die with vaccination, which is different than unvaccinated. And that seems to be the standard the FDA has laid forward for this vaccine. So the goal right now, and enrollment in phase 3 trials began in July, and they are aiming to enroll 30,000 healthy participants in the trial. So if those are the 3 phases of clinical trials after the preclinical testing, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is the federal agency responsible for reviewing all of the data and evaluating if this vaccine is safe, limited side effects, and effective, at least 50% effective, And then they get to decide with a body of scientific experts and advisors, is this a vaccine worth licensing? At which point the FDA can license a vaccine and it can be manufactured and marketed. If it becomes licensed, then the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices is part of the CDC. And what ACIP is charged with is evaluating all of the science and then making recommendations of who should use the vaccine and under what conditions. So the ACIP is the organization that is it's entirely scientific experts who have been appointed. They look at every available study, and they do things like set the vaccine schedules for infants, right? So when you think about like what vaccine you get at each age over time, ACIP sets those recommendations. It is advisory. They set the recommendations, the CDC publishes the recommendations, and then it's up to states to decide if they want to adopt those recommendations into school mandates. And that is the current process. And what ACIP might say is that certain people with certain underlying health conditions should not get the vaccine. ACIP might come back and say it shouldn't be used at certain ages because it's ineffective. ACIP reviews ongoing data, and so they were also the ones who said that a few years ago, the quadrivalent nasal spray vaccine was ineffective in preventing flu and recommended it be removed. So the ACIP meets several times a year. Their meetings are public, and they review science to make recommendations to the CDC. But our story doesn't end there. What's really important that nobody knows about is that we have an entire system of post-license marketing, and that there's a couple of systems that are really robust in doing so that are largely invisible to the American public. One is that we have a system called VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. And this is a voluntary system. Anybody can make a report. It can be a parent, a caregiver, a doctor, a patient. Anyone can make a report to VAERS. And VAERS is responsible for collecting information. CDC says they review VAERS daily and they look for information. Now, it's voluntarily reported, so we have no control group. I will say that there have been reports to VAERS, like somebody said that they woke up with huge muscles and they had turned green and more or less they had transformed into the Incredible Hulk. That's a VAERS report. So some are fanciful. There's also been reports of things that are coincidental, like somebody was killed in a car accident after getting vaccinated, and those have been deemed unrelated to vaccines. So there's lots of things in VAERS that are noise, but it's also a really good system for identifying what's a possible signal. But outside of those voluntary reporting systems, we have something called the Vaccine Safety Data Link. And what this is this partners with HMOs, healthcare providers around the country, and it looks at billing data. And it's looking for signals like, are there an increased rates of emergency room visits or doctor visits within 48 hours of vaccination that could signal something's not going well? And it looks for signs, and then it can do a deep dive into those medical charts to figure out what's happening. And VSD has been responsible for identifying patterns. So for example, these systems resulted in a rotavirus vaccine being taking off the market about 9 months after licensing. And the reason these systems are really important is for a couple of reasons. So one is that sometimes there's a tiny side effect that won't show up with 30,000 participants. It's statistically insignificant, as it was in the rotavirus case, until you have 500,000 people who got a vaccine. And then that 1 in a million complication starts to show up. The other is that people in the community might not look like the healthy volunteers in a clinical trial. So all of a sudden, vaccines might be given to people with underlying health conditions. They might be given to pregnant women. They might be given to people who were not part of the clinical trials. And so understanding what else could be happening is a really important function of these advisory groups. And they're part of us understanding what vaccine safety looks like and how it's monitored over time. And most people don't know about these systems, and having written a book about it, I came to be really convinced that we have a pretty amazing system that's much more robust than any other medical device or pharmaceutical product on the market. So that's what usually happens. That's the story until now. So what about a COVID vaccine? Now, in theory, all of these systems are in place. They're not specific to what kind of vaccine we're developing. And so all of these things should still apply to a COVID vaccine, except for a couple of things that might raise questions of whether that's what's going to happen. So one is that since 2004, the commissioner of the FDA has the power to grant what's known as an emergency use authorization. And an emergency use authorization means that the FDA commissioner alone, without having to consult experts or panels, decides that a vaccine looks promising enough that he can authorize its use before it's licensed. Now, this week, the FDA commissioner made some statements to hint that, in fact, this might happen, that he's really interested in granting an emergency authorization use, or an EAU, that maybe would allow healthcare workers or other key personnel and employees to get a vaccine before it's licensed. And there's some arguments about whether that should be broader, like can you consent to take an unlicensed product outside of a clinical trial, or is that not ethical? And there's some big arguments about how broad this EUA might be. Now, if you trust science and you trust the scientific method, you might be thinking, well, the phase 2 data looked really promising, and we don't know that it's efficacious. Like, we don't know if it prevents illness, but it does seem to generate an immune response. Isn't that good enough? You might feel really good about the emergency authorization usage. And if you're someone who feels like you really like robust testing with tens of thousands of people before you use a product, this usage might make you nervous. The other question we have to ask is, so I'll just say real quick before I move on, is that this is what usually happens. To give you, at the top is the traditional paradigm, what happens with vaccine, all the way up to manufacturing. And at the bottom, what you see is this is what they're calling, the New England Journal of Medicine called the Outbreak Paradigm. And what you'll notice is that one of the things that's happening with the COVID vaccine is that the clinical trial phases, which are usually linear and stretched out, are now overlapping, and what the FDA calls run in parallel. So they are starting to enroll phase 3 before they've completed phase 2. It's saving time. One might question if that's giving scientists adequate time to learn from the data at each phase, but you can see that this has been compressed significantly. The other question we can ask is, do people want this vaccine? So even if we get a vaccine, will anybody use it? And there was in the last month 3 different opinion polls. I guess this is August. So I guess they're some of them were in May and June. And these different polls suggest that between 50 and 70% of people say they would likely take a vaccine if one were licensed. Democrats are much more likely than Republicans to say that they want this vaccine, and African Americans are least likely to say they want it, which in many ways is unsurprising given the history of unethical medical research within the African American community in the US. And so one of the questions is, can we even achieve herd immunity if people don't want this vaccine? And if they don't want it, where does that leave us? So our estimates right now are about maybe as many as 15 to 20% of the American population has been exposed to COVID and has some immunity. If we were hoping for herd immunity, back to the Chippendale, like people just get sick and recover, we could move towards that. But since we have about 20% exposure now and 150,000 people have died, what we would expect to see then is that over 1 million people would probably have to die to hit a useful point for herd immunity. And that brings us to this question of maybe we should just make the vaccine mandatory. So do we mandate this vaccine? And some people see it like it'll be great, we can protect healthcare workers. And then of course, the people I study who don't want vaccines see this as a terrifying option. Now, outside of the military, the US does not have any laws to mandate vaccination for adults. Our only system of mandatory vaccination is in the school system for children, and the only point of enforcement is at school enrollment. We have no other systems of enforcement. We do know that in some workforces, like healthcare, you have to have evidence of vaccination and you have to have a flu vaccine each season, or you can be banned from work, you can be terminated from work, and in some cases, you'll be forced to wear a mask and have a badge that says you're unvaccinated against flu and denote that in the workplace if you're allowed to continue working. Right now, we have no institutions or systems that would allow door-to-door vaccination. We have nobody who could do that. We don't have a public health infrastructure that could support that. So there really are no major proposals to create this kind of mandatory vaccine checkpoint that folks who oppose vaccines are in fear of. But I'm going to fantasize right now that there's a different pathway forward, that it could be really interesting. So one is, we could think about what would it look like if the private sector took ownership of mandates and not the law. So Jacobsen is about the government and duly elected officials making decisions for the good of the community. And we don't really have a system outside of healthcare where individual employers or corporations could require vaccines as a condition of employment or as a condition of being a consumer. Right now, about 13% of childcare centers require a flu vaccine, and that's just to work at those centers. That's not driven by state law. The University of Tennessee announced early this summer it's going to require flu vaccines of all of its students, and I think it's the first school in the country to do so. But we could imagine would it be possible that airlines could require proof of vaccination in order to fly? Could we imagine that a nursing home wants to advertise that 100% of its employees are immune to COVID before you decide to take out a lease in that facility? What would it look like for a grocery store to want to advertise that their workers are immunized and therefore you can shop safely? We could think about what would this look like. And then if we ask that question, we have to think about how are we going to balance all of these things. Now, one of the challenges is that risk is hard to calculate. So each of us wants to feel in charge of making this decision for ourselves. And we want to be the ones to decide if we should risk infection, risk vaccination, risk going to class, we want to be in charge of making that decision, despite research that says that we're all pretty bad at risk assessment. And we're seeing these conversations about, the way young people are being accused of presenting greatest risk to the community since they're at lowest risk of the worst outcomes. And if young people are the most active in public and they might introduce risk to older people, are there ways we should continue to foreclose those choices? Or should we think about how do we protect everyone in the community, including those who are most vulnerable? We're seeing some of these arguments play out already over mask requirements. And Colorado currently has a statewide requirement for masks. And I don't think we've had the same brawls that we've seen in other places, but in the last week, there's examples of people being arrested for conflicts over masks, somebody being pushed down and breaking her leg, who was a transplant recipient and felt very medically vulnerable. But we see these kinds of arguments, and when you read them and see them and listen to them, what they're speaking to are the same kinds of arguments we heard in the Jacobson decision in the 1900s, the same questions about smallpox vaccination, which is to say, what are your freedoms, what are your personal choices, and what are the boundaries around those kinds of issues? Now, these are going to continue to play out, and I should say that there's a couple paths forward that we can think through. So one is that we can start asking questions about what kind of testing is leading to licensing, who's going to be making these decisions, and are those trustworthy processes in place? And if not, what do we need from our leaders to make those better? We should demand transparency. So one of the things that's happened with the COVID vaccine is that usually in order to get a vaccine to license, pharmaceutical companies want to be really certain it's going to work before they invest money in manufacturing. And what's happened in the US is that we've adopted under COVID and what Trump has named Operation Warp Speed. We have invested billions of dollars where the US government will assume the cost of manufacturing these vaccines. And if the trials in phase 3 don't work out, presumably we will be throwing away hundreds of thousands of unused vaccine that has already been paid for by the government and not the company. So the government has assumed all of the risk of manufacturing in order to have a stockpile in case the trials show success. And we can say that that's really exciting, that unlike the polio problems where we didn't have enough vaccine, we might have more. We also need to ask good questions about those trials and to make sure that if they're unsuccessful, those vials are not distributed irrespective of the money that has already been spent on them. And I would say that all of us need to think not just about ourselves and our own assessment of our own risk, but we really have to think hard about how do we support the most vulnerable people in the community? How do we understand who's most at risk and what we need to do to make sure they are safe as well? And I'll just conclude going back to our personal freedoms and the questions that were raised in the Jacobson decision. And this is the last quote from Jacobson, which is that real liberty for all could not exist under the operation of a principle which recognizes the right of each individual person to use his own, whether in respect of his person or his property, regardless of the injury that may be done to others. We are never alone in our personal freedoms. And so we have to think through what that means at a community level and how we ensure that everyone can equally participate. And with that, I'll stop there and then we can have a conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. Do you want to stop share? There you go. Okay. That was really, really interesting. And I feel like you got so much into that lecture.
It's good that I talk really fast.
No, it was wonderful. So we have some time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of your slides seemed to indicate that mass production of vaccines during a pandemic begins during the testing phases. Has mass production of a COVID vaccine for future use already started for distribution once the vaccine is approved?
Yeah, so if you've been following the news this week or last month, and if you want to go to the website for Operation Warp Speed, which is the sort of task force that's been created by the federal government to do this, what you'll see is that there are announcements of like Moderna received $1.1 billion and this company's received that much money to start manufacturing. And so as of last week, I think the Kodak company received money to start manufacturing. So we have we've already begun paying companies to begin manufacturing. And within, like, when you get into the weeds of this question, we have existing systems. In this particular case, the Department of Defense has been put in charge of distribution, not the CDC. And some people say, well, they're really good at logistics. And other people say, like, they're not public health people. And so it's worth kind of taking a look and seeing where those funds have gone and which agencies have been really charged with responsibility for it.
Right. All right. So what other pandemics in history have been viral in nature? Were the vaccines for those diseases also set at 50% effectiveness? That seems so low.
Yeah, so pandemics we haven't really had very many of them and in our lifetime. And so most folks right now have been pointing to the flu epidemic, the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918 as an example. And there's some very interesting histories that I'm happy to share with Kristen if she can circulate them about that, about the great influenza. To give you some scope of it, when you look at almanacs from that time period, the average life expectancy dropped by 10 years because of deaths from that pandemic, and there were no vaccines at the time. 50% feels low. And if it means that people then are not in the hospital, they're not in the ICU, right, then that would be a benefit. Or if it limits the amount of permanent lung damage that it appears this might be causing, then we would say that that's a good way of protecting people and better than nothing. But there has to be some kind of efficacy threshold. And that comes back to our risk and benefits model. How much risk are we willing to absorb? Nothing is ever entirely safe or entirely neutral. And then what's the benefit that we derive from absorbing that risk? And we are engaged in that conversation right now.
Right. Yeah, 50% seems low, doesn't it? Is there already an anti-COVID vaccine movement, and where is it coming from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is indeed, there was already a vibrant anti-vaccine movement happening. And in my research, I'm really interested not just in the activist side of that, but how individuals who say they support vaccines don't use them. And so how parents say, like, I believe in vaccines, I just don't want them, right? Like, what does that look like? And I think the data on this, I have somewhere, is something like 15% of people who are at least somewhat supportive of vaccines say they don't want the COVID vaccine, and 19% of people who do not identify as anti-vaxxers say they won't get it. And so we're talking about a really interesting crossover, which is to say, like, I trust vaccines, but this vaccine's making me uncomfortable, or I'm not convinced yet it's good enough, right? And that's going to be a sizable number. Amongst the more passionate viewers of this issue, there was an interesting crossover between activists who oppose all mandates for vaccines or oppose all usage of vaccines, of which we have some pretty well-developed organizations in the US, and those who opposed the stay-at-home orders and who also oppose masks. And so those have created an interesting sort of libertarian alignment that's really pushing back on the logic that public health should be looking out for everybody rather than individuals getting to decide for themselves. And that's a core tension. And I don't mean to overplay that we should always go with social solidarity, because I think it's really important that we also have diversity. It's really important we also have cultural difference, and that we have the ability to express what's true in our own families and our own communities, and we don't want to erase that. So we really have to think hard about how do we balance these different pieces to make sure the most vulnerable in our communities can be safe without creating forced, conformity across the board. And those are hard, complicated questions that deserve, I think, a lot more discussion and transparency than we're having right now.
Right. And do you think, I'm kind of just going back to something you said earlier in your answer, that the people who generally support vaccines but are kind of wary about this one, do you think that is due to the fact that they feel it's being rushed?
I think having this sort of expedited process of review and arguments over whether do we really need a phase 3? I mean, there's literally an argument this week about do we need a phase 3 or not, and to say we could license a vaccine with a few hundred participants.
Right.
Vaccines are a higher bar than other medications, right? They are injected into the body. They work on the immune system. They aim to be permanently affecting your immune system. That's really different than having an antibiotic that you have a reaction to and you stop taking. So the bar historically for vaccines has been much higher, and they've also means that it's much more politically controversial than most other medications and medical devices. And thinking through that. And if you're interested, I wrote a piece for Vox last week, sort of walking through like how are the folks who oppose vaccines viewing this, and the questions that are being raised about. There's also some questions to ask about conflicts of interest. So Operation Warp Speed is headed by folks who have financial investment in the vaccines. And in the past, that's been considered unethical and unacceptable. And in this particular political moment, it's been deemed okay. So the person in charge of overseeing this owns, I think, $10 million of stock in Moderna, which has been a recipient of significant federal investment. If you feel uncomfortable about vaccine safety, there's some good questions to ask about how are those conflicts being mediated and how are they being managed in ways that don't compromise the quality of this vaccine in the end.
Right. Maybe you could send that link to your article and we can put it up on the website.
Sure, I'm happy to.
That would be great. So does data still suggest that COVID impacts children less frequently and with less severity? How do you think that aspect of this pandemic will impact vaccines in schools in particular?
Such an important question that I've spent so much time thinking about. So in the very first days of COVID, there was this belief that children were super spreaders. Children were going to get everybody sick. Children were the problem. And then it became really clear that children don't spread this very readily and they don't get sick. And that's unusual, right? Like the polio vaccine was entirely about children. The measles vaccine's been about children. Our history of infectious disease is almost entirely about children. And if you want to play like a thought game, you could think about how might we have responded to COVID differently if it was young people and not older people. And how might our government respond different, like look different because of that is like an interesting thought experiment. But so we're still learning. And I think it's really like as a thread through all of this, we have to remember we have only known about this for about 5 or 6 months. And we want answers instantly. And it feels really quick to say like, well, people are changing their minds, so we don't know anything. And what's really important is that just because we don't know everything does not mean we don't know anything. And so we know a lot. So what we're doing right now is we're trying to figure out what more we can learn. And it's complicated because what we get in the media is not what the scientists are necessarily saying. So when it comes to children, last week there was a study that was promoted everywhere that children have more virus in their nasal cavities than do adults. So they have a density of virus. And we assume that means they're highly contagious. But having virus is not the same as being contagious with virus. And those have to be taken apart. And the media doesn't take that apart for us. But those are really good questions. This week, we're really obsessed with this one story of this one summer camp that had to close because kids got sick at summer camp. And we're like, see, we can never open schools. But if you look at the CDC MMWR, which is where the Morbidity Mortality Weekly Report is where infectious disease information is printed. And they've been researching this camp and trying to figure out what people did and how they did it. The things they do at camp, they were yelling and cheering and singing, which we know are dangerous activities, are super spreader events for aerosolization. And they were doing things that are different than people do in school. So it's not entirely generalizable. We also know that the infection started with adults, not children, right? That children weren't the ones who brought it. It was adults who infected them, camp counselors. And so thinking about how do we pull these apart to make decisions is really hard. And because we're not sure what to do about schools, we're having a hard time figuring out the path forward with the science that we have. So right now, people are thinking maybe young people are more, like teenagers are more susceptible than we thought they were. And young adults might be more susceptible than they thought they were. But a lot of the infections with children have originated with adults, not children, if that makes sense. It's been teachers and adults in the presence of children who have brought the disease in, not the children themselves. And that's a really important epidemiological question we're going to need to make some headway on. We're going to make headway on.
Right.
We're going to need headroom to make headway. Yeah.
And it feels so overwhelming, I think, the question about children just because of schools, you know, and the, whether we can reopen schools is such a huge, huge question.
And one of the problems with that, so the vaccine is not being tested for anyone under 18. So it will not be licensed for children safely, or it should not be licensed for children without testing on children, because what we know from medical research is children are not just mini adults. Their metabolisms are different, their brains are different, their blood-brain barrier is different. Like, they need different studies, and there is no study of COVID vaccines in children. So they will not be a candidate for vaccination anytime in the near future. What I think that the new paradigm we have to start thinking about is that there's not a world where we're going to be 100% free of this virus, and that we're going to have to start making decisions about how we control risk, how we manage risk, and how we make decisions. And even though the vaccine feels like it's going to be magic and there'll be rainbows and like everything will go back to normal, there's no reason to believe that's true. And there's very smart people worrying about how we would even distribute a vaccine. Like, how do we get vaccines to adults? Only 45% of healthy adults use the flu vaccine right now. So how would this be different? How do we distribute them? What kind of refrigeration and storage would that require? How would it get paid for? Are real questions. But then also thinking about, even if we have this, and even if it's 50% effective, that's not going to create zero cases. So when we know that, we have to start thinking about then, okay, if we can't get to zero, what's our target at which point we can say children are safer in schools than not in schools? Because it's not like being home is a neutral intervention for most children. Many children are in worse health for being home than at school.
Right, right. No, it's really complicated. And it's kind of like how we talk about the flu is something that we live with all the time. I mean,
Yeah.
is that kind of the goal with COVID, or are there different morbidity rates? Is the flu less dangerous than COVID? Is that?
That's a great, those in the early days, this has been an argument. And one of the problems is because I think what Ginny Adams started with at the beginning of the series, like, we don't have an R0 factor for this, right? We don't know what herd immunity looks like yet, because we don't know how contagious it is. And we don't know what the baseline is we're working with. So it's hard to calculate, is it more or less infectious? But on average, about 30,000 people die a year of influenza. So it's not, we think of the flu as like a bad cold, and it's a lot more than a bad cold. And so we don't always think of the risk that way. And most adults say they don't want a vaccine against the flu because they feel fine, they're young, they're healthy, they're going to manage illness fine. And those are not dissimilar to what we're going to hear with COVID either, right? That a lot of people might choose not to get this vaccine because they figure they can handle infection. And that's a limited perspective when a lot of the reasons we vaccinate are not for ourselves, but for other people around us.
Right. I think that's a good point to end on. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
A really, really excellent lecture and way to end the series.
Good.
Thinking about the personal in relationship to the community, I think, is really important. So thank you, Dr. Reich.
My pleasure.
And thank you, participants, for being here throughout the series. And
thank you to Marjorie and Kristen for this amazing summer. It's a nice note to end on, but it was an excellent contribution.
Thank you. And be safe and healthy, everyone, right? Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.